Thank you all for joining us for the Tips and Tricks from Graduate Teaching Assistants Workshop panel. Joining us today are Dustin Davis, doctoral student and graduate assistant in kinesiology and nutrition sciences, Chris Wakefield, doctoral student and graduate assistant in sociology, Jessica Soria, doctoral student and instructional technologist and content creator, and also a former GTA and lecturer for Greenspun College of Urban Affairs, College of Education, and the Academic Success Center, and Warren Forbes, doctoral student and graduate assistant in interdisciplinary health sciences. So they are all going to provide you with some tips and tricks and answer your questions that will help you succeed as GTAs. So I'm going to go hand it over to them just to introduce themselves a bit, and then we'll start taking questions. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Warren.
I just want me to say my name is Warren Forbes. I've been teaching here at UNLV, taught a couple of the undergraduate courses and some labs as well. I've also spent some time teaching at Cal State Fullerton as well, teaching other undergrad and upper division classes with kinesiology and health sciences.
Thanks, Warren. Dustin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Dustin. I am a doctoral candidate here at UNLV. I mostly teach anatomy and physiology, some exercise courses, and then I've done that for 2 years now, and then I previously taught for 2 years during my master's program in Missouri. So that's me.
Thank you. Jessica?
Hi, everyone. Like Nev said, my name's Jess. I'm a doc, also candidate for the first semester from teaching and learning. And I've taught internationally and East Coast, West Coast, but I've been home here in Nevada for the last about 5 years.
Thank you. And Christopher?
My name is Chris Wakefield. I'm a doctoral candidate in the sociology department here at UNLV, and I've taught a lot of different classes, both as a TA is obviously where I started, but I quickly moved into teaching as the instructor of record. So I have a fair bit of experience designing my own classes and running them, both introductory classes as well as upper division and required courses. So I teach, right now I'm teaching statistics for our undergraduates in the sociology department. Before that, I was teaching our required theory classes. I've also taught gender and sexuality and crime, online, offline, hybrid, remote synchronous, you name it, I've done it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. It sounds like we have a lot of great and varied experience among our panel. So while you all think of questions, I'll just go ahead and jump right in and ask our panelists, what are some of the main responsibilities you've had as a teaching assistant, and did they vary based on the different classes you've taught? I'll go ahead and hand it over to Chris first.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, I think this depends a lot on, so if you're starting out as a teaching assistant, your responsibility is, at least in my experience, vary quite a bit from instructor to instructor that you might be assigned to. So some faculty members that I worked with actually had me provide lecture content in the class. Other faculty members did not want that assistance. Instead, they simply wanted grading assistance and an additional set of office hours to help guide and tutor students who are struggling. I found that attending those classes and essentially mastering those instructors' lecture contents was particularly helpful for me, because I oftentimes ended up having to re-deliver that content again as a teaching assistant. That changes quite a bit once you become the instructor of record, obviously, because then you have to do all of the design work yourself, with the exception of maybe working off of someone else's template to start. So yeah, you should very much expect that as a teaching assistant that you're going to be facing some unpredictability in the beginning in terms of what your exact responsibilities are. You're going to have to look to the faculty members that you're working with, if you're working with faculty members, to determine and sort of negotiate what those responsibilities are and make sure those are quite clear, because some faculty members will they've been doing this a long time, and maybe they don't always realize that you may be new at this and you need some additional handholding. So don't be afraid to ask questions that feel a little stupid or feel a little minor at first. I certainly was. I was terrified of asking faculty members I was assigned to questions about teaching and exactly what their expectations were. So like if they say, just grade this, well, you know, you might ask for some specificity, like how harshly do you want me to grade that? You know, how do you want me to handle certain sorts of cases? You can ask that sort of stuff.
Thanks, Chris. Does anyone else want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Chris hit like a lot of like the major points that it can honestly vary department to department and even within a department from instructor to instructor. Here at UNLV particularly, when I was a GTA a couple years ago from it could vary within a department as well because it depends on if it's a 101 course that has multiple sections, then the department wants to keep that 101 course across its 10 different sections, and let's say you're only responsible for 3. It wants to keep it pretty uniformed, right? And that's necessary because students, despite who their instructor is, they should be receiving the same content. However, if you are teaching a 101 course and maybe you're the only GTA, and you are the instructor, right? They can just, I have also just been handed over a syllabus and I had complete autonomy over the course. The last thing that I would want to reiterate that Chris started the conversation about is grading. Each instructor, let's say they only want you to primarily help with grading and office hours. Each instructor has a different philosophy, for lack of a better word, on how they start grading. Maybe the very first big paper they grade really, really intensely, you know, for lack of a better word again, really intensely because they want to set the precedent of their expectations. And then they not necessarily soften their grading, but they aren't as intense. Other instructors may believe the opposite, may have an opposite philosophy, that the first assignment, they're a little bit more generous and kind and flexible in their grading. So solidifying that, I think it's a great conversation that like Chris really hit like all of the major points on its head.
I'll just jump in and reaffirm something that Chris said, which was that it's really good to ask questions from faculty that you respect and that you are either working under or that you know, maybe you're not working directly under them, but you had them for a class or you know that they are a skilled teacher. Because my first semesters on the job as a teaching assistant, I was instructor of record. Actually, my only experience being a teaching assistant has been as instructor of record for the past 4 years. And so it was for me a daunting task to walk into a classroom full of 20 or more students fresh out of my bachelor's degree and then fresh out of my master's and say, hey, I'm in charge of everything about this class, knowing how to handle situations with students, or as Jess and Chris both talked about, grading appropriately. So my biggest piece of advice is no matter whether you're an instructor of record or a teaching assistant that's primarily involved in grading or offering tutoring hours or open lab hours or office hours, just ask around and get a feel for how other faculty do their job, because they are the experts and there's a lot to learn from them.
All right. So, what surprised you all about being a teaching assistant? Something you didn't expect when you first started?
I'll begin. So, for me, when I started being a teaching assistant here at UNLV, it really surprised me. I had taught previously, but I wasn't a student at the time. It was after I graduated with my master's degree, and I was just teaching on itself as a lecturer. But when I became a teaching assistant here, what surprised me first was the time commitment to be able to balance between a student, one as doing your coursework, and then teaching on the other end, and making sure that your students that you're teaching get the best quality of you and giving the best information out there, making sure all their questions are answered. So that was the first thing that really surprised me when I came here, when I started my PhD work, was finding that balance and managing my time as best I could, and setting aside time just for teaching / office hours and grading, and then setting up my side as well for my own personal student duties. And I think another thing that it's easy to forget when you become an instructor is how the students actually feel in the course. And you think, because you're designing everything, oh, this is easy, they should be able to do this on time, and I think I set everything perfectly up. But understand that your course is not the only course most likely that the students are taking. They have other stuff that they're doing as well. So without being too lax and giving all the time, you have to be understanding, because I think it's, as yourself being a student, you should understand what they're going through and try to adapt and understanding as to what the students' desires are, and just be sure to manage your time as best as you can to be able to give them the best quality content from your end and give them your all as an instructor, because you ideally would hope that they carry that knowledge into whatever field in their career that they are going into. So that was, to me, what surprised me the most was trying to balance that time and be able to give my most to the students as well as my own time as a student.
Anyone else want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'm thinking of like the very first course that I ever taught, and not necessarily what was surprising, but what was most intimidating and challenging for me was facilitating class discussions. I come from the school of thought where it's very important that I do not enter the classroom, from what Paulo Freire, who's an educator from Brazil, would call the banking method. So I didn't want to just stand in front of the classroom and just share a ton of information and then class is dismissed and the students leave. It was really, really important for me to ensure that I was creating a dialogue around the classroom or in the classroom. And that was really, really intimidating and really, really scary when I was handed over just a syllabus and like, oh, here are some PowerPoint slides that past instructors used, right? I didn't want to just present. So for me, it was really important to sit down and think of questions, not to ask, not the method of like cold calling to see if they did their reading, but to really pull out a conversation of students. Yeah, that was the biggest challenge for me.
Dustin, did you have anything?
Yeah, I'm just going to be candid here and say I was surprised by how many questions I got asked that I didn't know the answer to. I think that as we come in as teachers or as new teachers, we are wondering, we come in with the desire to teach students to the best of our ability oftentimes, and there's a lot of content that we're responsible for conveying. And you know, I have a master's in my field and I'm working on a PhD, but I still get asked questions all the time that I'm like, I don't know. You know, it's been a while since I've looked at this content, and so I think that I had to learn to humble myself and be honest with students and say, hey, look, I don't know the answer to your question, but here's how I'm going to help you find out. I think that as a teacher, we have the responsibility to be honest about what we don't know instead of just giving an answer to, you know, keep an untainted reputation as being the all-knowing person at the front of the room.
Yeah, I love that, Dustin. That's part of like creating a dialogue, right? Is saying that I can also learn from you or we can learn together, right? I remember the term that I was like, it was on the tip of my tongue. It's called problem posing. And we're asking the questions together so that we can figure them out together. Even me as your instructor, even Dustin as your instructor, or whomever, or even you as the instructor, right? I love how you just captured it. It's like humbling ourselves that we don't know everything, even though we are experts in our field.
I'll also jump in there and say that I imagine a discussion like this might attract a fair number of people who maybe have a lot of doubts about themselves, about their ability to even teach a class. And if there's a single thing that maybe surprised me the most when I came into a classroom and started speaking, it was that I was surprised to discover how much I was potentially capable of teaching classes. I came in very, very doubtful of my own abilities. I came in saying, well, I'm just a graduate student. I don't really know what I'm talking about. I don't know a lot of this stuff. And I was surprised to discover exactly how much I did know as a result of that conversation, as a result of the content that was going on in my classes. And I will say that for a lot of you who are coming in as a new teaching assistant, you might have doubts about your own abilities. You might have doubts about your own content. Well, the truth is, you know, as others have been saying, like, yeah, you're not going to know the answer to every question, but you probably know the basics more than you think you do. Um, and even if you don't, even if you have to do what Dustin is doing, and I'm also doing with statistics actually, which is sort of reviewing the content as you move each week through, because you need to refresh yourself on some of those components of it. The act of teaching it is a reinforcing for yourself. It's not just that you are teaching your students, you are also sort of training and reinforcing that content within yourself. So even if you are worried that you might botch a lecture or a laboratory or some advice, you know, that's part of the growing process. The part that your teacher, that your faculty members maybe don't tell you is that they had that exact same experience. They had tons of stumbles along the way, and those are acceptable. You have to learn how to teach as well as help your students learn the content.
Thank you. And thank you all for your honesty. It sounds like it resonated with some of our participants here that say that that is their concern, not knowing the answer, and, you know, sometimes having to fill in for their advisors when teaching classes and being worried that they look like they don't belong in teaching. So thank you for sharing that.
And before we continue, I just want to call out like something Jessica just said in the chat. Like, this is really, really important. I hope every person is reading this, because this is something graduate students, especially young graduate students, often lose sight of. Like, your department picked you because they already have confidence in you. That confidence does not mean an expectation of perfection. They're expecting you to be learning to teach. So learn to teach. So come in learning to teach. That's really, really important. Like, do yourself a favor, copy paste that statement from Jessica, print it out, and, you know, post it on your desk somewhere, because you may need to be reminded of that over and over and over again. That's perfectly okay. Like, just hold on to that. That's the perfect advice.
Thank you. I wanted to open it up to see if anyone in the audience had any questions they wanted to ask. You can feel free to unmute yourself, or you can type it in the chat.
I got a question sent to me privately, and I won't share the students' names since it was privately, but they said, since you mentioned Paulo Freire and the banking model, which he is he opposes the banking model. He is a firm believer in problem posing. The question asks, how would you suggest building dialogue more robustly, since I'm a GTA teaching valuing cultural diversity? So I do want to preface it by saying that problem posing isn't necessarily a fit in every single classroom, or it's more challenging in some classrooms than others, right? Like in a science course, how do you ask students their thoughts on it? And it may be something as simple as like allowing them to make a mistake, right? Or allowing them for like the light bulb to go off on themselves. Well, why does 2 + 2 = 4, right? Like if I'm keeping it in really, really simple terms, well, 2 + 2 isn't 4 because I've memorized it. It's because 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So problem posing is a little bit more difficult in some fields versus others, but I'm of the belief that it does belong in every single classroom, asking questions, right? Yeah, like Joyce said, being a guide. But in your particular, this student that's asking this question in that particular field, even beginning with the question, why should we value cultural diversity? And if some of us at this moment believe that we shouldn't, or it isn't something that they value, accepting that as a place in the classroom, right? Accepting that stance. So not everybody's going to walk through your classroom having the same exact belief. I also believe in like accepting the whole student as they enter the classroom and not just the bits and parts that agree with your syllabus. But yeah.
Thank you, Jess. Does anyone else want to ask a question? Feel free to just directly chat me if you wanted it to stay anonymous. All right, so while you all think about that, we will ask our panel if they have any suggestions or tips for new teaching assistants.
Absolutely. I would say first and foremost tip of well before your class even starts is to reach out to some people who have taught the course before you to see some expectations that they had of their students, what worked for them, what didn't, see if they will maybe share some of their PowerPoint slides with you, or if it's just a grading share, how they graded, what the instructor expects of them to grade. I think that reaching out and preparing very far in advance as opposed to right before the semester begins or as you go through the semester is much less stressful on your own end. And that's what really helped me when I first started teaching. I went right to the several instructors that taught it before me and asked them what worked for them, what different ways to get the students learning hands-on, what worked best for their particular students. And then tied in my own few things. I think that as an instructor or as a teaching assistant, you have your own experiences, and whether that be in prior research or your prior work history, that will help you give you somewhat of a little advantage, a little of an edge to your own teaching style. So incorporating what previous instructors have done and worked for them, as well as your own personal characteristics that make you set to do what you're supposed to do, is going to get the best out there for your students and help them to learn and ease the stress on your end. And obviously I said it's best to ask at the beginning and not ask throughout, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't ask throughout as well. If you have something that you try to do and it might not have worked as best as you thought, or you came across some issues that you want to know how previous instructors handled it, I think that really helped me out quite a bit when I was teaching, especially when it came to like testing time and if you have to make your own test. I think that it really helps to see what previous instructors have done before you on your end.
I want to expand on what Warren just said there for a moment. One of the first lessons I had to learn that I learned the hard way was that students, especially at UNLV, but also in other places, can detect when you're not being genuine with them pretty quickly. And as a result, I would recommend not just asking faculty members, not just even asking your colleagues, fellow graduate students, but as the course goes through, speak frankly with your students about how the course is doing. Sometimes pedagogically we call these check-ins, where we will set a little bit of time at the beginning or an end of a class to ask students, how is the class going? How is my teaching working out for you? Is there stuff that you wish worked a little bit differently? Do you have any early feedback? You can do that verbally. You can also ask them to like write you notes. You can set aside 5 minutes at the end of a class time to write some anonymous notes on a piece of paper, what you think is good and not good, almost like it's an early evaluation. So this is especially valuable. I did this when I first started teaching stats labs. Not every critique will be perfectly valuable. Sometimes the critiques will just be like, make everything easier. But hey, even if you hear make everything easier, maybe there's a legitimate thing that's a little too difficult or stressful that could be made simpler without lowering the intellectual rigor of your class. Just because, don't sit there and think to yourself like, oh, just because, college is supposed to be hard or whatever. Yeah, it should be challenging. Absolutely, it should be. And I'm one of the foremost proponents of ensuring that students are challenged in my classes. But Sometimes designs end up just creating additional difficulties that don't need to exist and are not helping people learn, right? And you can learn those things, whether that's something as simple as like your PowerPoints are just too wordy or not wordy enough, um, or the lecture sort of drags on points that are maybe not the most important to cover, or maybe, you know, you take too much control over the discussion. There's a million different possibilities. Honestly, I'm teaching statistics for the first time and I'm terrified. I'm terrified of teaching statistics. And I told students at the beginning of class, I'm like, look, I'm going to ask feedback often from you because this is the first time I've done it. It's a brand new class. And like, if you help me make this better, then it'll be better for you. Like, it's a team sport. It's a team sport.
Something that wasn't touched upon, y'all, and I hate to be like the boring, you know, Betty here, but oh no, I'm sorry, it was touched upon. Warren started to scratch upon this early on about staying organized, but we can't say that enough, because you don't want it to bleed in and to start to compromise your own studies. You're here first and foremost as a student and to obtain your degree, so that should not fall wayside. And the stress of work, the stress of teaching, the stress of your personal life can and will bleed into your academic studies. So whether you like the Passion Planner or Google Calendar or your iPhone calendar, or you like build your own calendar, I can't think of the name of it. Is it bullet journaling, right? Whatever it is, 1,000%, that is going to be the foundation of your success. Staying organized. Sorry to bring in such a like dull like point, but it's true, y'all.
I'm really glad that you, Jess, and also Warren touched on, you know, organization and thinking about the stress of balancing multiple responsibilities like work, being a student. And you're talking about it from our own perspective of like how we're managing. So I wanted to segue a little bit into like my tip would be for us all as teaching assistants to understand that we have a pretty strong influence about how our own students are doing. The reason I say this is because, you know, imagine being a student again that's like an undergraduate and getting like an email at 7 p.m. on Friday night talking about how like you didn't do this, this, and this, and how that make you feel. My point is like we, in the way we talk to our students and when we message them, can really affect their quality of mind and how they're doing mentally. So, you know, Chris touched on being frank with students. It's important to be direct and frank, but also be compassionate and be empathetic with students because they're not just a student taking your 3 credit hour or however many credit hour classes. They might be in 4 or 5 others working a full-time job and a parent. You know, they have a lot going on more than we might realize. And so my tip would be to try to put yourself in the position of your student when you're interacting with them. And then also, I really am a strong proponent of setting boundaries about when you're communicating with students. So like I don't think it's good to be emailing students at like 9:30 p.m. with what you need them to do or what you want them to do. If I have something I need to tell a student and it's after 5 p.m. on a weekday, I schedule that email for the next day because like Gmail has the ability to schedule emails to send out. So I think that respecting students' boundaries in terms of time and then also trying to empathize with them is critical.
You brought up something that like reminded me, and this did not occur here at UNLV, y'all, but it was when I was a GTA at a different institution. And I remember very vividly, I was teaching like a 101 course that had multiple sections, and there were other GTAs like myself that had their own sections and that they were the instructors. But we had to, like I previously mentioned, follow departmental rules as far as no extensions, not accepting late work, and very strict deadlines. If you're the only instructor, maybe there's flexibility and it's at your discretion, but in this instance, in particularly, I didn't have that flexibility to accept late work. But I remember very distinctly that my colleagues would be laughing at students like, oh, you missed the deadline. Oh, well, can't accept it, even if it was by 1 minute. And then in the same breath, in the same day, in the same like hour, then turn around and ask their own instructors when they, as students, for extension on things, right? So I remember being so furious at that situation, but there was nothing that I can do because I had no power. So yes, remembering compassion, but at the same time, if you don't have the power to accept late work, then like Warren said, and like Dustin has said, like being honest with your student and say, look, I want you to be successful. I wish I could accept this late work. It's beyond my control. Let's get a head start on the next one, or let's make sure you score really, really high on this upcoming test. Refocus on what you can help them with. So it's very complex in some instances, and there's so many different factors. So yes, being compassionate, but then knowing where you do have the power to be more flexible on things. And then if you can't, being honest with the student. But then there's boundaries, right? It's difficult. It's difficult, but going back that you were chosen for a reason, but just keeping all of these different variables in mind. Sorry to make it sound scary, y'all.
Thanks, Jess. To get a little more into the weeds, how do you approach helping students that are struggling with material?
For me, I think it begins by personally, if you notice a pattern of either work not being turned in or not performing well on homework or tests, what have you, I think it begins by just simply reaching out to the student and just saying, hey, I noticed that well, you didn't score as well on this one. Is everything okay? Like, is there anything like can I help you out with anything? And if they respond, sometimes they might say they have personal issues over the last X amount of time that's distracting them from this. They might not understand the material, and if that's the case, then that's up to you as the instructor to ask them what they don't understand and then go through those concepts with them. But I think that taking the initial step to reach out means a lot to that student, and then honestly puts a little more accountability on their own selves because they see, oh, look, my instructor noticed that I'm not doing well. I need to pick it up now, as opposed to just seeing that they're not performing well and then just not doing anything about it. That's really like they see that, well, they must not really care too much that I'm not doing well, and I'm not going to care either. So I know it's up at the end of the day, it is up to the student to be able to do their work and perform in the classroom. But I think that as instructors, going the extra mile and reaching out to your students when you notice that they aren't doing up to what you would like them to be doing in the classroom, I think that goes a long way. And you never know, that can inspire that student's having trouble, and then they see another student having trouble, they can say, oh, just go talk to your professor. They'll be able to help you out just like he or she helped me out. So I think that's how I personally handle things if the student didn't directly come up to me and ask questions, which I think that's at least in my experience, a little bit more rare for them to go out of their way to come to office hours. I think that a lot of students are intimidated for whatever reason, to go to office hours, especially now that things are online. I think that it's more intimidating to set an online session to meet one-on-one with your instructor. So yeah, I think that going out of your way, even though it might seem a bit cumbersome to do that with a lot of students, if a lot of students are struggling, just reaching out to them individually. Don't put them on blast in front of the class or in a group email. Just do it individually. And I think that can go a long way with making them want to do better in the classroom.
This is an opportunity also to like implement the can't think of an alternative word, but the sandwich method, right? When you're grading, so a compliment, then something that they can improve on, and a compliment. When you send that that reaching out email that Warren mentions, right? Like, hey, I'm just checking in on you, giving them a compliment and saying, hey, I really loved what you said in class today, or I really loved how you explained this in your paper, or hey, you did a really great job on this quiz, right? I've noticed that the last couple of quizzes you've missed, right? So packaging in a way, what it's called a mud sandwich. It's a mud sandwich. So the bread is the compliment, then like the mud is the not great thing, and then the bread is another like compliment. because that is also an opportunity for the student to build that confidence in themselves, right? That, hey, my instructor noticed like that I did this well, so I do have, there is a silver lining, I can pull this grade back up and pass this class.
I think on a very general level, feedback is essential. But I think, like Jessica's kind of pointing out, the sort of feedback you give makes all of the difference, not just in terms of how it's packaged, but in the quality of it. And this depends a lot on the sorts of coursework that you're doing. So if you're teaching algebra or calculus, you're not necessarily engaging with students' opinions or values as often, right? But what you can do is take a little bit of extra time to not just mark something off, but provide more details. Like when I was grading labs and statistics, and I would look at, oh, well, this is the statistical output that they turned in, it's wrong. So how might they have gotten to this wrong place? So I would usually pause when I would mark something wrong, and I'd say, well, like, how do you get here? Is there, in a couple of minutes, could I replicate what happened to get this student here? Because at the core of it, it's not just, oftentimes they're not just whoopsies. They are substantive misunderstandings about the task that are built into it. Why would you make this choice versus this choice? Well, if you had actually thought, if you were confusing, means with standard deviations or what have you, then that might explain why you would come to this outcome. So starting to return back to those explanations, not just to mark something off, but actually to provide clarity. Because you're not always going to be able to get every student to actually talk to you. So as it turns out, feedback gets really important. It's even more important if what you happen to be grading is writing, which a lot of us here at UNLV do have to do. Even if it's more technical writing, providing feedback that actually engages with their substantive goals in that writing, and is sort of honest about the process by which you get to a good paper. I find, particularly at UNLV, one of the weaknesses of students is writing quality. I came from a private institution in my undergraduate where you had to have like a 3.6 or a 3.7 just to get in the door. And so I was very accustomed to reading and being around folks who were already very good at writing. But I also spent some time working in the Clark County School District schools before I came here, and I have a little bit of a sense of what kind of education gets on there versus where I came from. And one of the things that oftentimes is missing is really good advice and technique about writing. And so sometimes it helps to focus on what they have and deliver them both the successes and failings of that, but then also sort of let them in on some of the things that probably weren't in their education, but maybe you've gotten at this point. So maybe they don't really have a familiarity with the term active voice. You're not going to teach active voice in your class because, hey, you're not an English teacher. You're a sociology or a history or a philosophy teacher. But maybe bring that in anyway and be like, hey, here's a couple ways in which you can kind of build up some of that writing skill. This is what the academic world is going to be expecting of you. Just sort of like what we call the secret syllabus in sociology and in education studies. There's all this unspoken stuff in academia that we don't typically cover very often. And a lot of that comes up and is actually at the core of a lot of mistakes that are made in assignments. We can sort of reveal what remains unspoken in a lot of those things by giving better and more thoughtful feedback, by doing what I think it was Warren was saying, putting yourself in the shoes of your student a little bit more and asking yourself, like, where is their performance actually coming from?
Did anyone else want to add anything? All right, so our next question here is, have you all experienced nervousness when public speaking or teaching lessons in your classroom, and how have you handled that, or do you have any tips for overcoming that?
On my end, it comes down to when I've felt the most nervous in front of the class. What Dustin mentioned it previously, was when I didn't know what the answer to the question was. That's when I was personally most nervous, because I figured that the students were going to be like, "Oh my gosh, how is this guy teaching if he doesn't know what he's even talking about?" But at the end of the day, it was touched on as well. You guys, you're here for a reason, and your institution has all the confidence in you to be able to instruct that course. So that's what you should be thinking about in the back of your mind, is that I am here for a reason, and these students are here to learn as well. And even though that's, you naturally tend to think the worst, oh, they think I'm this, they think I'm that. They really don't. They're really there to learn, and they see you just pretty much like the institution sees you as well. That you're not necessarily an expert. I don't think anyone's ever an expert. There's always ways to learn more, but you know quite a bit to be in that position. So just having that in the back of your mind, and even in times when you don't know the answer to the question, even being confident then, and like Dustin says, hey, I'm not too sure, but I'll look into that for you. It's a lot, and actually do follow up after you say I'll look into it for you. Be sure to actually follow up, and yeah, that's it's remaining confident and understanding why you're there is what really helped me out on my end. But absolutely, especially the first few times that I taught it in person classes, it was very nerve-wracking. It's like even the first day, just doing your basic syllabus check through and your introductions, it's very nerve-wracking. But eventually, as you keep going through and having more confidence in yourself and understanding why you're there in the first place, it should really guide you and help push you through the semester and dealing with students.
One thing I'll add to what Warren said is, well, I mean, the underlying point I think you're making, Warren, is that it's pretty natural to feel that, especially in a situation where you might not know the answer to a question asked. And I think that there's this stigma about feeling nervous when we publicly speak, like we shouldn't feel that way, but I think it's a very natural human response to speaking in front of people, especially if you're supposed to be knowledgeable and teaching someone. And I mean, the underlying bodily reaction to nervousness or being anxious about something is also, it's about the same as excitement. So to me, it indicates that you care about what you're doing. If you didn't care, you wouldn't be nervous, right? But you care and you are nervous. So I think that remembering when you feel nervous, that it's because you're there and you want to do a good job. Hopefully that reassures you that you're on the right path. And by being honest, too, as Warren pointed out, I think that can alleviate some of the anxiety, because what's worse than not knowing the answer? Acting like you know the answer and really not knowing it and then being found out. So just be honest and be genuine, and I think that will help you ride out those feelings of anxiousness or anxiety standing in front of the room.
Yeah, Dustin hit it right on the head, even just naming it. So one of the courses that I used to teach was public speaking, and I have had every reaction from students. A student running out of the classroom and throwing up right outside in the middle of their speech. But renaming it as like excitement, right? Like you accepted this GTA position, right? You accepted the offer. So there's something in there that you were interested in, right? So it is, and it is an exciting position. It is an honor to be appointed as a GTA and to be trusted in the classroom. So naming it and saying like, hey, I'm really excited to be here with you all, to learn with you all, to grow with you all this semester. Also, one thing I do want to just acknowledge, if you are teaching multiple sections, each classroom has its own vibe. The actual building of it And then the students, the dynamic will be different. And that's not necessarily something that you have complete control over. As much as you can be encouraging and create a classroom environment or have an influence over your classroom environment, at the end of the day, the dynamics of between the students and even of the building, right? Like you really don't have control over. But yeah, nervousness around public speaking, we all have it. Or let's rename it, right? Excitement around public speaking.
Yeah, I love that comparison too. Dustin, I had never even thought about it in those terms, but it's exactly the sort of situation that I've experienced. So I walk in terrified, even now. I've got, my bag of stuff, and my only armor is a blazer, and off I go into the thing, but once, 12:59 turns to 1 or whatever, and I start moving, I take all of that bundled terror and I just channel that into, like, I put the energy somewhere in front of my students, and if the only place that I can put it is the lecture content or the discussion or whatever, then you know what? That means that I jump around the classroom a little bit more. I I'm a little in my intro classes. I am like a very exuberant person. I do all sorts of like weird social experiments inside my classroom, but most of that, it sort of comes off the cuff because I'm so anxious and I'm so wound up because I don't know what else to do and I'm terrified. And so I let it all out as um maybe foolish confidence. I don't know. But like when I ask a question and a student answers, I don't just go, yeah, correct. I go, yes, yes, exactly that. Oh my God, yes, beautiful. Thank you. Say it again louder so the rest of the class can hear you because you said that a little quiet, and I want everyone to know how amazing that response was. Yes. And like that's what I have to do with my anxiety and terror. Instead of getting quieter, I just force myself to get a little bit louder and a little bit more excited about everything else around me. So every response the student gives all of a sudden is a song from God, and every and the same thing, by the way, goes for stuff that is confusing or hard. If I don't have the answer to a question, like my anxiety, my terror about that, I just force that to be why don't I know the answer to that question? And so then the class discusses for a few minutes, like, why wouldn't I know the answer to that question? Like, where is that information missing? Or maybe there's a more interesting quandary in the theory or in the textbook or even in the course content or how a university works that might inform why those answers are not so easy to have, and that becomes its own interesting discussion. And I've just forced myself to do that because otherwise I become a shrinking violet and I can't I'll just collapse if I don't put it to use. um, and so I think that's a wonderful way to think about it, that anxiety can be a sort of fuel for you. Um, if you're afraid or you're nervous, then consider that the fire under your butt, that it's make or break time now. And then, like, how can you make that problem become just a little bit more fun? And that becomes my modus operandi, I guess, for how to deal with these things.
Thank you all. So another question we got is, what are some effective ways or technologies you've used to facilitate student interaction? If you all have any tips about that.
I think that partially depends on the method of instruction. For if it's online, like asynchronous type of learning, then I think that one of the most effective ways is through discussion. boards. If it's on Canvas, that's probably the most effective way where no one has to ever be actually in contact with each other. That's what I personally have used. In person, it was a bit easier to get the interaction in with each other because, especially in my field of kinesiology, which is a lot of movement science, I think the best way to learn that is by doing it and then learning the science behind it afterwards. So it's pretty easy concept to have students working with each other and doing a particular movement, and then for me being in biomechanics, learning the biomechanics behind that particular movement. But it really, to answer that question, depends on the method of instruction, in my opinion. I think that for today's time, with most classes being either asynchronous or synchronous online, I think that the best way for me that I've found is through having like little discussion assignments, whereas a topic you post up and then have students comment what they think, and then have them answer 1 to 2 questions or 1 to 2 comments and respond to those, and so forth from there.
I haven't done this personally, but I'm aware of one professor who did something this semester that I thought was really innovative and got a lot of engagement. Because I agree, I think, especially when we're communicating asynchronously, Warren, that it's hard. Discussion posts are great, but sometimes it's hard to get people to get engaged, especially if it's not required for a grade. And so this professor asked students on the discussion thread to share 3 things about themselves at the start of the semester, but they had to use a different form of medium in each way. So you had to do a video for one, or text for another, or like a meme for a different one, just different ways of sharing information about yourself instead of just being a short paragraph all in text that describes who you are. And I thought that was pretty cool. It's the same task, right? Sharing things about yourself, but it's engaging in a variety of ways.
I find this really hard. I find this really hard. I had a really bad experience trying to run remote synchronous classes these previous semesters, and so I'm back in person in mine. And so far, the only thing I've ever tried in any one of my classes that I felt like was really successful in this regard was I actually had students do phone calls with each other. They could do this multiple ways. They could do it over something like Skype or WebEx. They could give each other a literal phone call, and they would have the same partner. Basically, I assigned them a partner or a couple of partners across the entirety of the semester. And basically what they had to do was just record a conversation between the 2 of them. I would have 2 or 3 general discussion questions about the content of the class up until that point, and they only had to do this 3 or 4 times in the whole semester. But I just had them audio record a conversation with each other so this was for a Sociology 101 class, so I was asking them questions like, we ran through classes on how, or we ran through content on how race, class, and gender function in a society. They had to then have a conversation about how they might be able to apply those to certain things in the news or whatever, something that would seem topical. And the students were randomly assigned. I didn't let them pick, so that they would be sort of coming up with students that they might not otherwise group themselves with. And then they would just record these conversations. And that was the assignment. They didn't have to do anything else. All they had to do was have 30 minutes of conversation audio recorded. That's it. They just turned in the audio recording. And I would skim through them. And honestly, students griped about the very beginning of it, getting things scheduled. That was the difficulty. But then after that, I got tons of great feedback about, tons of positive feedback about those conversations, because they were talking to students they otherwise would have never encountered. And they were surprised by the nuanced thinking of their peers, in a way that even in an in-person class, they might not have gotten to that level of depth with one other person before. Like, we'll just breeze over people's views and move on. And actually, I had like 2 or 3 groups of students who actually emailed me at the end. They're like, we really hated this assignment when it started, but by the end, honestly, now we're friends and we're hanging out outside of class, and that's cool. And so thank you for giving me like my new freshman best friend. And that felt pretty great. But honestly, I haven't had great experiences with feeling like there's a lot of engagement in discussion posts, and a lot of other methods that I've tried. And I don't know, I might be like a Luddite in this regard, but it hasn't felt like a lot of engagement has come out of those sorts of things for my students anyway. I don't know.
Thank you all. So we only have about 1 minute left. So before we end today's session, I just want to give a huge thank you and shout out to our panelists for sharing your time with us today and for being candid and honest and giving some really great tips and advice. And thank you to our participants for joining us today. Before everyone logs off, if you all can just take a couple minutes to fill out our workshop feedback survey that I'm just about to drop in the chat right now. It really helps us as we plan for each semester. So thank you all for doing that, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.